If there is anyone out there who still doubts that America is a place where all things are possible, I say, if there is anyone out there who still doubts that America is a place where all things are possible, who still wonders if the dream of our founders is alive in our time, who still questions the power of our democracy, tonight, I say tonight, is your answer.
Voice of Sonia Sanchez, playing of Christian McBride. My name is Yvonne.
I'm Terrell.
We're so pleased to welcome you to the first edition of Are We Whole Yet? Are We Whole Yet? We're so pleased to be thinking about our story together, not just Black history, right, but Black history within the wider story, right, that we can only tell together in this land, in this context, and to be thinking about it, right, beyond February. James Cone has been heavy on my spirit and mind, particularly this month always, but was thinking about the fact that, right, when we allow suffering to speak, as he so eloquently encouraged us to do, right, suffering doesn't just speak in February, right, our suffering's been speaking, and I think we need resources to think about how to allow it to speak to us throughout the year. And so we're thrilled. We have four really brilliant, beautiful people to help us think not only about Black history, but the way we engage the past in the present in meaningful and creative ways.
You know, one of the other things that's really important when we think about Beyond Black History Month is that we go beyond Black history being for Black people. You know, Black history is American history. It is global history. It is something that is a part of every single one of us. And even those sufferings have an impact on all of humanity still today. So it's important to think about it much further and much deeper than just what we do to acknowledge it in February.
Absolutely. So are you whole yet?
I've been thinking about that in preparation for this pilot. Well, are we gonna be asking people, are we whole? Am I whole? I don't think I am yet. I'm not there yet. I'm working on it. I'm getting closer, mind, body, spirit, everything like that. I'll tell you, the work that has happened during February and the emphasis on my Blackness and the way that navigates throughout, I've had some moments of less than wholeness, but I'm getting there. Yvonne, are you whole yet?
Absolutely not. Absolutely. I'm on the journey, and I'm so grateful, right, to be surrounded, because all this for me is right. It's really about the community, and so I'm so grateful, right, that the community has shown up, and we get to rap and talk. And I'm curious. I'm absolutely not whole, but I am deeply. My soul is curious, and so I'm just so grateful. Want to invite our guests to introduce themselves. Tell us about you and your work. Starting with April Johnson.
Well, it's a pleasure to join you all on this podcast today. I am Reverend April Johnson. I have the privilege of serving as Executive Director and Minister of Reconciliation for the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. That is a long title to say that I have the responsibility and the call to direct the church's journey toward wholeness in their efforts to eradicate systemic racism from their policies and practices, as well as I have the privilege of directing a mission fund to complement and to undergird those efforts. Welcome.
Thank you. We're so glad you're here. Brandon.
Good afternoon. Thanks so much for the invitation to be here on this podcast, on this inaugural episode of the podcast. So, it's one thing to be invited, it's another thing to be invited on the first show. So I don't take that lightly. So thank you all. I am Dr. Brandon McCormack. I'm an associate professor of Pan-African Studies and Comparative Humanities, which is where the religious studies program is at the University of Louisville. I also adjunct at Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary, which in some ways brings together my academic training. I did doctoral work at Vanderbilt University and the Graduate Department of Religion. I did work in homiletics and liturgics on one hand, this kind of practical theological discipline, and history and critical theories of religion on the other, which was to say that I was doing work on Black religion and cultural studies, involved in a theology and practice program. And so on the other side of that, I got to come back home to my hometown, my home city of Louisville, Kentucky, where was an undergraduate and become a professor of religion in the Black Studies department, and still be able to teach over across the street at Louisville Seminary to seminarians who are studying for ministry. So it's been a good 360-degree journey.
Awesome. So thrilled you're here. Rick Lowery, can we invite you to introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Rick Lowery. I'm ordained Disciples of Christ minister. I have my PhD in Hebrew Bible from Yale University. And after teaching many years at Phillips Theological Seminary, and then I did a little stint as dean at Lexington Theological Seminary, I eventually just moved to Indianapolis and adjuncted at a variety of places for a while. And then a few years ago, was called to be president of the Disciples of Christ Historical Society. Our place here is located in Bethany, West Virginia, on the farmstead of Alexander Campbell, who was, one of the founders of our movement. If I might just say, during Sharon's tenure, we coined this kind of identity statement for ourselves that we are a movement for wholeness in a fragmented world. And I just wanted to comment on the whole question that y'all were talking about before. I mean, we are moving toward wholeness, but we definitely are not there yet. And this very location I find myself is just a living testimony to that. Alexander Campbell was a very problematic and at the same time progressive person. So he's a real mix. That's who I am.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We're so glad you're here. Great to get to know everybody. And then last but not least, Beverly Goines.
Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. Beverly Goines. I am the Associate Pastor for Care and Christian Formation at National City Christian Church in Washington, D.C. I'm also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University and the Associate Director of the Disciples Center for Public Witness. Happy to be here, and thank you for inviting me.
Awesome. So thrilled to have Louisville, West Virginia, D.C., and Chicago, and Kansas City, Missouri, all gathered and assembled here on the air. Want to invite you, let's just jump in. How is the past meaningfully engaged in the present in your work, right? We know the past is always informing us, right? The previous moment is always informing what is going on in the present moment, sometimes not so critically so, right? It's not because there's been intention in terms of how the past informs the present, but it in fact does. I'm curious, how does it show up, right? How does the past show up in the work that you do? April Johnson, why don't you tell us about that?
So the past critically informs all of my work, and that may be my particular perspective but I stand on the shoulders of folks who created in the midst of a church that was invested in its structure, right? Moving from a movement to a denomination. You had some brave folk from all spectrums, a handful of them that said, our cities are on fire. And we need to address civil unrest, and the church needs to say something about that. And so I have the privilege of serving now in that directorship to continue to lead the effort to what reconciliation now means in the 21st century, in light of what was set up for us in the late 20th century, as we were dealing with urban unrest, as we were dealing with the fact that we were becoming a denomination, and yet we were not fully serving all the communities in which we had presence. And so that's one way that informs my work. But the reality is, one of the things that I find that we are dealing with now, in terms that we have the capacity to deal with now, particularly with this the group of panelists you have here, that particularly that we have the opportunity to really deal with how we have not dealt with the past to advance the work of reconciliation and anti-racism, or I would just say really clearly eradication of racism, which seems like a lofty goal. But the reality is, until we deal with, I was thinking about this, it's been in my spirit, I'm doing some other work around trauma, and how in the work that we do, when we center our anti-racism analysis in a social historical analysis, we're centered into a shared historical trauma. Now, I was reading some work that said, when we talk about trauma, it's a disturbing, distressing event, right? That's just the definition of trauma. But folks that experience trauma, when a traumatic event has happened, that you have bystanders, that you have victims, and you have victimizers, but all are victimized by trauma. And because when we're talking about racism, we need to amplify the reality that we have to go back in the past and address the historical trauma that has shaped the narrative that we're living into now, so that we can have a progressive and an inclusive shared narrative that we move into to do this work called racial reconciliation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Brandon, I want to invite you to jump in here. How does the past show up in? I know you work in multiple contexts, but what's on your mind today?
In multiple contexts, I think the history of past shows up in multiple ways, and like Reverend Johnson just said, we stand on the shoulders of those who have created the context and the spaces in which we currently occupy. One of those, and perhaps a primary context will come in, is Black Studies Department, right? And to think about Black Studies as emergence of Black Studies within the academy is to say that these were activist scholars who were keenly aware that history, right, and the history of African Americans had been erased and denied within the intellectual experience altogether, right? And so it was to say that our history had been erased, and that it wasn't being taught within the context of the university system, let alone K through 12, right? And so it was this whole project to make the history of African Americans included within the educational process, but not just for the sake of doing so, but so that we could learn it, so that we could build upon, so we could be informed by that history and build upon it in order to be able to intervene in the present, right, in ways that created social change. And so to be in a Black Studies department with young people, with students, many of whom are coming into college without having ever had any real exposure to African American history, right? It's a significant calling and responsibility, right? Because now you have to walk people through that history. And Reverend Johnson already mentioned trauma. So it's one thing to think about traumatizing experiences as one that traumatizing experiences that one has lived through, but it's also to sit with students as they experience the trauma of realizing what has been denied to them, right? And then when they are going back into the historical archives and learning things that are so traumatic, have been so traumatic in our history, and increase the level of rage. And so what do they do with this rage and this anger at the fact that it's been denied, and at the, rage at the injustice of it all? And how do they handle that? And so there's this kind of pastoral role, if you will, in educating people into a history that has been denied them, and helping them to think about how to hold that in ways that are generative, right? And that, can be transformative in the present moment. Many more things possibly to say about that, but perhaps let me end with this. I think about the work of Octavia Butler, and you and I, Yvonne, certainly have talked Octavia in the past. But Kindred is one of those books, right, that people read in high school if they get exposed to any African American literature. Of course, that main character, Dana, is living in LA in the 80s, and she gets transported back into history, right? And she is transposed back into her genealogy. What she doesn't realize is her genealogy at that moment, and is reliving these moments in slavery, right? And it's a traumatic experience, because it'd be one thing if she was just jerked back into that history, but then she reappears back in the present. And then every now and then, without knowing when it's going to come, she's jerked back into history again, and then back into the present. And the jarring experience of what it means to be in the present and then thrust back into the past and be traumatized by that, right? And then at that moment at the end of the novel, when she finally, I guess, makes it out of what is about to be her death in the historical period back into the present, and she comes back, but she is missing a limb, right? She's missing an arm that got trapped in the past. So what does it mean to have gone into the past and come back maimed, right? So that connects to your question of are we whole yet? And the irony of when you go back into the past to discover parts of yourself that had been left behind, you might just come out of it traumatized or even maimed, right? And so it's fascinating to me to think through this in the context of a Black Studies department.
Wow, thanks, man. That was great. Rick, we invite you to jump in and help us understand where you see the correlations between the past and the present.
Oh, wow. Brandon, that was, man, that was fantastic. Wow. It reminds me of that quote from William Faulkner, where he said in one of his novels, the past is never dead. It's not even past. The past is present, and it is so important for us to be clear-eyed about the past, because the past is constant. I mean, it shapes everything. The reality of the enslavement of human beings is such a fundamental part of American culture, and it survives today. I mean, it's not in exactly the same form that it was in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries, or even in the early 20th century, but it shapes us to the core of our being. The legacy of white supremacy, which was essentially an ideology that was created in order to soothe, white consciousness over the fact that they were enslaving human beings. I mean, I talk about being here in the home of Alexander Campbell. This is also the home of James and Charlie Poole, who were two young men, enslaved human beings, who Campbell bought from a Methodist pastor to help him herd his sheep. Eventually he gave them papers of emancipation, and they moved into Bethany Village proper and continued to work for Campbell, getting actually now paid for the labor that they had been giving him for free, against their will, for all these years. But we are living with that legacy, and of course it has different impacts on different folks in our culture in different ways. But it's just in our hearts, and it sneaks up on you, and that legacy, it shapes the way you interact, the way we interact with each other, the decisions that are made, anyhow, what Brandon just said was so powerful to me. We have got to be aware of our past in order to understand our present, and in order to be able to act in our future, to try to create a more whole, a better, more just and equitable world. So I guess I'll just quit there and say more when it comes back to me.
Thank you for naming, right, that not only did Alexander Campbell inhabit his home, right, but that there were, for naming, right, the two brothers as well, right, because they inhabited the same space, but in a different way, right, in the same way the way that we inhabit and interact with the past.
Well, and furthermore, these are the only two names that actually I can find. There were other enslaved human beings on Campbell's plantation, Campbell's farmstead out there. But, their names are just lost to history because they, why do you need a name? That was their way of thinking about it. So, yeah. So what energizes me right now in my work is my commitment to, before I ultimately leave this position, trying to tell the stories that have not been told, from the communities that have been underrepresented in our history. And so I'm really committed to write this stuff up and try to recover and publish this history so that people know it.
I'm glad you bring up this whole idea of naming names. I do love everything that each of you have shared, but this is also challenging us to remember not only the names of history from centuries ago, but from last year. The names from 2 years ago. It's like history happens so quickly. And so we have to remember to hold on to that history. It's very, very vital. Beverly, we'd love to hear from you.
Sure. My research and the class that I teach at Georgetown is on Black churches and ecumenism. And so when you talk about ecumenism, you're talking about church union. When Black people enter into ecumenical dialogue, topics of racism, morality, and ethics come into play, in addition to theology, doctrine, and ecclesiology. So when you get into discussions with Black and white people, you can't tell a Black person that you're made in the image of God, but at the same time, don't treat me as an equal. So you get into this paradox between orthodoxy and orthopraxis, right belief versus right action. And history comes into play into my research and work because I look at the intertwining of Christianity and racism from antiquity through up until the present, where I look at the intertwining of racism and Christianity through the Renaissance and Enlightenment as a product of the Reformation, colonialism, the transatlantic slave trade. And you see how these things still are in play right now. And how not only in ecumenical discussions, but when you look at religion in the public square, and see how it plays out, and understanding that we are still battling this heresy of racism within the Christian church today. We're still trying to eradicate these beliefs right now, and understanding the past is important to understanding what we have to do now and what's at stake.
Fantastic. That each of you provided such important elements of understanding the role that the past and the present play together. It actually feeds right into a segment we want to introduce that deals with the ampersand. You see, we have ampersands on the side of us. And so we want to give you an opportunity to really understand what we mean. And specifically for this episode, we want to talk about the ampersand of history. So what we mean by that is the ampersand of history is like a place, a subject, the movement, the analytics that were false distinctions and how they get made, but then also the more expansive view and understanding is definitely appropriate when we think about those, what some refer to as intersectionalities. But for you, how would you, and let's start with you, Rick. What is the ampersand of history as you see it?
Well, one important ampersand, particularly in our North American context, U.S. American context, is the I think false distinction that gets made between the secular and the religious. we even to talk about secular is kind of problematic, I think, in, to my way of thinking. My teacher, one of my teachers, Letty Russell, a great feminist liberation theologian, she used to talk about, well, something that she learned Beverly, from the global ecumenical movement. Her work with the Faith and Order Commission of the World Council of Churches, and the Baptism, Eucharist, and Ministry document, and the Lima the Lima Conference, and all of that. But what they came up with in their work was the idea that there are no non-theological issues. I mean, anything that we're dealing with really is a theological issue. And in American culture, you can't talk about American culture without talking about religion. It's so central to everything that we are. And even people who say they're not religious, I mean, there's a kind of religion about that. So to me, this distinction between secular and religious is a problematic distinction. I think it's rooted in the fact that we strive to be a pluralistic nation. That is to say, we don't want to privilege, one tradition over the other. The whole governmental separation of church and state, which I think is really important, and in fact has allowed religion to thrive in the American context in a way that it hasn't in a lot of other places. But being pluralistic and respecting the freedom of religious expression is a different thing than saying we're a secular culture. We're not. We're a deeply religious culture, and it's important for us to understand that if we're going to understand anything. I just remember when I first went to Cuba, and how when Castro finally let people kind of openly be religious. I mean, 98% of the country kind of came out of the closet. All of these people who had been high-ranking officials in the Communist Party in Cuba, they're suddenly declaring themselves as Christian because they were all along. So anyhow, I think it's a similar kind of phenomenon in the U.S. It's so important.
Yeah, that's great. Recently, I had a T-shirt made that said, "I'm spiritual and religious." It's like, why do I have to be one or the other? It's like, I'm both. I love both of that. So that's great. April, where do you see these potential false distinctions, or just the ampersand of history as you see it?
I think for me, I'm a little more general. I mean, I really appreciate Rick's comments in terms of centering it in our Christian expression. But I actually think the ampersand for me is, I think that Black History Month and our cultural heritage observations are really good for anyone who participates or learns from it. I learn something new all the time, and I have a bent toward learning, right? But the reality is, I think one of the false distinctions that's put forward by having those is that that's alternative to our history, to American history, to our church history, right? And so I think that, and so the novelty, I think about, in Beverly Goines' work, the novelty of the Black church is not novel. You know what I mean? It's a part of America. It's the American journey. It's the American experience. I mean, that's who we are. I mean, again, when I talked about trauma earlier, I'm not talking about trauma just in the negative sense. Is that, we inflict this stuff on ourselves because we are trying to live into this false distinction that there is one way of being an American. And so this Black History Month, we know we got, Black History Month, 365, 365, T-shirts and things like that. But the reality is, I think it also goes to Dr. McCormack's work, and they're helping us understand that the gap between learning our entire history repeats that that false distinction, but it also creates a narrative that anything that is different than the dominant narrative, which we are now calling, a white supremacy narrative, is an alternative or a distinction from that. But really, it is a contributor to that. It is why we protect white supremacy, if we tell the truth, because we don't want to talk about the fact that the reason why we protect white supremacy is because our overall narrative is to perpetuate an otherness that creates a dominant narrative that contributes to our understanding of basic values that we have as a country. And what Black History Month does for us, what these Cultural Month observations help us to do, is to interrogate that narrative and say, is this who we really are? It's not, it's not an add-on, that George Washington Carver did all these things with a peanut. Do you know what I mean? That's not the point of, this work. The point is to ask us, what do we value and who do we say we are? And the difference between who we say we are and what we value is where I believe our opportunity is.
Fantastic.
Amen. Beverly Goines, where do you see an ampersand? What's the ampersand of history?
My ampersand of history, and once again, I think we have about 32 hours left in the 2021's Black History Month. And with that in mind, this kind of ampersand in history versus a more expansive view is that I believe that every Black person, no matter where they come from or what they consider their station in life, is that they have something positive to contribute to their community and society. Every Black person who continues to go into the classroom or into the boardrooms or into their workplaces and have to confront microaggressions and being skipped over for promotions or not being taken seriously, you still need to consider yourself a part of this expansive view of history and a contributor, and to see oneself as a stepping stone of Black people in the course of history. We all have to see ourselves as paving the way for those who come behind us, whether our name and our deeds make it into somebody's history book or not. And so I think that ampersand is to just see ourselves as, no matter what we do, still bending that arc, in whatever way possible. So much negativity is heaped upon Blackness. And, we have to define ourselves and who we are and how we see ourselves and what we contribute to our larger society and to the world, each and every one of us. And so that's where I see that that distinction, this ampersand and this.
Yeah. Thank you for naming the self, right? Black identity is what I'm hearing. Yeah. It's that place where false distinctions get made. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then Brandon, tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I'm just caught up listening to you all's conversation. And so in some ways, drinking all of that in and all of your other ampersands in this interesting conversation that you're having. Rick brings up this kind of sacred secular divide. I think that's a really interesting, false binary. And then to think about that for me within the context of Africana or African diaspora study, which is to say that binary itself seems to me a Western imposed and even white supremacist construct, right? So there's this long idea that within African cultures, there's no word for religion because religion is not separated out as this separate category from the rest of life, right? And so not only is there this kind of sacred secular divide that we should rethink in more expansive ways, but for me, as somebody who does Black religion and cultural studies, which is to say the religion and culture is another false divide. It's like, where does Black religion stop and Black culture begin, right? And so these things are always interwoven and in conversation with each other, right? And so Ralph Ellison is in conversation as a writer with the Black religious and Black preacher tradition, right, in Invisible Man, right? And so that whole idea in that sermon that the Invisible Man gives when he goes into his state of almost dreamlike state when he's been smoking reefer, by the way, which disrupts the sacred and the secular. And then he says this sermon on
let's speak the truth,
right, the blackness of blackness, right? And so he begins to talk about Black will and Black won't, and Black will get you and Black will leave you alone. But there's this whole idea where he's riffing on the sermonic to talk about the ways in the Black culture and Black religion and Black social issues are all intertwined with one another in ways that you can't really ferret these out. So at what point do I stop teaching about Black religion and start teaching about Black culture and vice versa, right? And so we think about this, and so, but even within Black culture, we have ways of reinscribing that and to say, well, where does, this is what we do as Black church, but this is things that are not germane to the church, right? This is outside the domain. No. These are always interwoven, which was why I always appreciate Yvonne Gilmore's work, right? As a pastor, but also as a poet, but also as a member of the Cornel West theory, right? And this kind of intellectual and activist and artist tradition that's all interwoven together, right? And so to take those things up together for me are very, very important. And I refuse those kinds of false binaries, which leads to the ampersand that I was actually going to get to, but I'm just building on and riffing off of you all.
Oh, wow.
Talk about, which is this other ampersand, right, that happens where the false binary between, say, scholarship and activism is created, right? That in some ways to be doing legitimate scholarship is to be objective, is to be disinterested, right? Is to be doing something that is not polemic, or it doesn't have this kind of community engaged sensibility, which again is another construct of the white supremacist imagination, right? For me, that within Black studies is a tradition that scholarship has always been about how to be community engaged. It has always been about how to learn, right? And this kind of Marxist, the scholars have interpreted the world, but the goal is to change it, right? And this kind of Gramscian tradition of what it means to be engaged in the world, right? To do this kind of intellectual vocation as a kind of work of being engaged in community transformation, but not just as this one-way street, right? That means that you have this top-down flow of information from the scholar to the community. But it is this exchange, this creative exchange between intellectuals and artists and activists, that in that communal conversation that we're thinking together about how we do this transformative work, right? So as scholars, our minds are changed by having walked with and engaged with activists, and the activists' minds are changed by having heard the poetry of the artist, right? And in that kind of, again, cacophony of voices, or that kind of symphony, or however we want to name it, I think we get at something that becomes more generative and transformative than a certain model of the academy, right, could have imagined, but also a certain model of activism that sees itself so socially engaged and woke that it doesn't have time to study. Right. But understand that to be engaged in contemporary forms of activism without having a serious understanding of the historical work of activism, right, that has gone before is deeply problematic as well. Right. I encountered that with a group of young people today, which were beautiful. Many of them former students of mine who have a context they call Books and Breakfast, which emerged out of Ferguson, right, among activists who were building upon the Black Panther tradition, right, of the free breakfast program and doing community education and so on and so forth. And they're taking that over and they're doing wonderful and beautiful things. But they showed a clip this morning of Kwame Ture, formerly Stokely Carmichael, talking about what he saw as the distinctions between mobilizing and organizing. And it was rhetorically brilliant, but Kwame Ture, went so far as to say, well, Malcolm was a mobilizer and an organizer, but King, he was just a mobilizer. he was no organizer. And I had to say, wait. You know what I mean? Let us dig into history critically. What could it possibly mean to talk about the man who organized the Montgomery bus boycott and who organized the Poor People's Campaign and who is as not an organizer? And so to become radicalized in this moment of militancy, and we said we're going to lift up Kwame Ture, right? And we're going to point to Malcolm in this moment in ways that historically erase the organizing work of King is just this intellectually dishonest, right? And so that scholarly aspect and that historical critical sensibility has to come together with those young activists on the ground, not in a way to come in as a scholar and say, I know better than you, but to say, young brother, young sister, we all woke in here, but let's talk together, right? Historically about how to inform this activism in ways that are not reinventing the wheel.
That's right. Amen.
Got excited.
Awesome. What a rich conversation. Awesome. We're gonna move into our final segment of our show. I'm so excited because the segment is called Voices You Should Know. And the reality is you just encountered 4 voices that we all should know and get to know really well. But these 4 voices, well, I'm so excited. They're gonna tell us about 4 persons, right? 4 people that have shaped them, that have influenced them, and exposed us even beyond this. So I don't know if somebody wants to go first. I'll invite you, Beverly Goines. Why don't you tell us about the voice we should know?
So the voice you should know is the Reverend Dr. Courtwright Davis. This was so hard for me because there are, so many others who have influenced my life. The Reverend Dr. Dolores Carpenter, Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas, Dr. Frederick Ware, Dr. Why can't I call his name? It's on the tip of my tongue. Dr. Thomas Hoyt Jr., who is the senior bishop of the CME Church. They were parts of my dissertation work, theologians that I studied, and Courtwright Davis was one of them. And Courtwright Davis is actually an Episcopalian, a part of the Anglican Church, but he was a part of my ecumenical study of Black churches because some Black people in predominantly white institutions still consider themselves a part of the Black church. And as Courtwright Davis said, no matter where a Black person is, even if they are in a white church, a hermeneutic transfer has to go on inside their Black ears to make what they hear relevant to the obstacles, the racism, the challenges that they encounter outside of that church. And so one of the things that
I just need to shout real fast. Yes. I'm sorry, please continue.
And so one of the things that Courtwright Davis developed was his own theology, which he called the theology of ebony grace. And the theology of ebony grace has 4 main points. One is that God made me. 2 is that when God made me Black. 3 is when God made me Black, God did not make a mistake. And 4, whom God made, God loves. Blackness is not a divine mistake. It is a distinct demonstration of the grace of God. And, I had to get ebony grace tattooed on my wrist to remind myself when I'm in some places and some settings with some people that God didn't make me a mistake and I was where I'm supposed to be, wherever that is. So needless to say, Courtwright Davis has been a blessing to me. This was a segment that was from one of the classes that I was teaching, which I will share with you right now. And it's just maybe 1 or 2 minutes.
In Africa, wherever we are, as human beings, we share a lot in common. And this has become clearly evident because of the pandemic that has traversed the whole global community. So I stand at the very center of my existence, and each of us, we stand at the center of our existence. However, we have 5 things in common, and I list them as follows. Number 1, we have a common origin. In other words, we're all born the same way, the process of procreation. Number 2, we have a common predicament. That is to say that we are always surrounded by the problems and the challenges of life, especially disease at this particular time. Number three, we have common ground. The common ground means that we have the same basic needs, not only for survival, but for thriving. Number four, we try to promote and pursue the common good. Now, this has three dimensions in itself. Not only is it spiritual, not only is it moral, but it is also cultural. So the common good we pursue. And the fifth one is that we share a common hope. The common hope is that we want to live as long as possible, and we want to hope that life tomorrow will be better than life is today.
Courtright Davis, thank you so much. Thank you. Awesome. April Johnson, you want to tell us about a voice we should know?
So in keeping with the spirit of Beverly Goines and DC's presence on this podcast today, I want to share Reverend Kane Felder. Reverend Dr. Kane Felder is a huge influence in my theological education and in my theological bent, and in the work that I do. I went to Howard University. Beverly was there with me, and some year, or two ago or several. And I was a little put off by Dr. Felder's arrogance. I was aware of his large influence in the New Testament scholarly field. I was aware of his preaching prowess, but I was not impressed, and I actually wasn't going to go to Howard. But long story short, I ended up being his executive assistant. And in my first class with him, what really endeared me to him was the challenge that he presented to us when he talked about the story of Moses and Zipporah, and the way in which the lens that we bring to that biblical interpretation, and that clearly that Aaron and Miriam must have been dissatisfied with Moses because Moses' new wife Zipporah was Black. And we bring that, it's not just uncritically, we bring it naturally. So theologically trained or not, naturally, our mindset goes to there is a concept of race. There's a construct of race in the Bible. And so how Dr. Felder has influenced me is to continue to ask the question in my own biblical interpretation, is there any way that the construct of race really is in the Bible, or is this imposed? So I know I have a perspective that is imposed, but I have to always prove it. And so he gave me the skills to do that. And so that particular story, and so many other scholars have picked up on that and looked at the importance of Zipporah and how favorable Africans were viewed in the Bible. Randall Bailey from ITC, one of those. And so that really influences my hard work when I am doing exegesis, because it's really important for who I am, not just to see me in the Bible, but also to present to all walks of life the reality that we bring a narrative, a way in which we've been shaped into our biblical interpretation. And some of that narrative in terms of the work that I do now really influences our inability to question when we're talking about racism. Are we also talking about the ways in which the white supremacy narrative has influenced our understanding of economics, and how economics actually inform the way we relate to each other, and how we read that and impose that into the biblical narrative, as well as race. And so those types of things really influence me, as well as I do my work with the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in encouraging folks to do anti-racism work, it's more than just having an understanding of the meaning of race, but having an understanding of the application of race in the ways in which we do it individually and collective in our theological interpretation. So Dr. Kano Felder is a huge influence in the work that I do and the way that I do biblical interpretation. But I recently ran across this young woman you all may have heard of, and I have a clip for her. And she does, because I've been doing this work for much longer than I ever thought I would, much longer than I ever thought I would. Did I say that twice? Okay. Who does this work called Talking About Racism from the Heart. And her name is Dr. Amanda Kemp. And she does self-care work around entering into the conversation of racism. And you know how we all are taking yoga and we're learning how to breathe again and get in touch with ourselves. Well, she actually gives people like skills, like 3-step skills, simple skills, not as complex as maybe a social historical understanding of racism in the United States, but how to be prepared to enter into that conversation you're eventually going to get into no matter where. You know, Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter. Do you enter into that conversation when you may not have the energy for that? Or do you practice self-care and enter into those kinds of conversations from a standpoint where the conversation will be generative and helpful?
I couldn't do this work if I didn't have a mindful self-compassion practice. The reason why so many people of color, I think, especially Black people, are often burnt out, angry, despairing, is because we don't have good self-care and self-compassion practices built into our daily lives. When I started to do mindful self-compassion practices, things changed for me dramatically. All of a sudden, being here wasn't so difficult to get to, and it wasn't just a place of pain to avoid. Here is also greenness. And to cultivate that greenness here takes mindful self-compassion practices. So I do a metta meditation. Again, we have that out there available for folks. We do holding space for transformation meditations. We do something called field flow. I mean, we know that you are a body, a mind, a heart, and a spirit. And all of that needs to be tended to so that you can show up in alignment. So what you say and what you do and how you be are in alignment. None of us is perfect. I am not perfect. I am constantly learning and growing. But the practice keeps me in this with a sense of well-being, with some access to joy, without denying, what is unjust or what's wrong or what's suffering.
Thank you, April, so much for that new voice to some of us, but we need to hold on to these voices. Brandon, please help us to learn a new voice, a voice that we should know.
As I was sitting here thinking, I had a voice that I sent in, and it was the voice of Stuart Hall. Stuart Hall was a brilliant intellectual, Jamaican-born migrant to the UK, and was a co-founder of the Center for Cultural Studies there, an architect of Black cultural studies, and brings together so many of the ideas and the things that I've been talking about here in terms of, these ampersands between religion and culture, or just culture and really activism and art and activism and so many wonderful things. And in fact, we could still drop the link for folks to check that out, and I can even give the numbers. But before Reverend Johnson went into the actual clip, it struck me that we may have a series of all male voices, and I thought that would be a tragedy. And so I did not want that to be the case, and so I felt moved by the Spirit to actually move my voice to a different voice, and I still want to do it, even though there's already another woman's voice, because we don't want it to be a tokenized one woman voice, right? We want multiple voices here. But also, I think that this move in the Spirit is actually interesting and important, perhaps because it moves outside of the academy. And now it's a poet's voice. And I want to take this poet's voice very seriously as an influence on me. And many of the things that you've heard me say, you will hear echoed in this woman's voice. And I will give all credit due to Yvonne Gilmore for years ago introducing me to this young woman's voice, who has been absolutely amazing and powerful. If you're not familiar with the work of one Maimouna Youssef, one AKA Mumu Fresh, do yourselves a favor, because one of the things that Stuart Hall talks about in the clip that I was going to share, and that you still may have access to via the link, as he talks about the vocation of the intellectual life. But he says, never be confused that the intellectual life is only happening within the academy. It is happening in multiple other sites among people who are not trained as academic scholars and intellectuals. They are no less our intellectual interlocutors and teachers, right? And so allow me to share my screen and show this clip from Mumu Fresh's Tiny Desk concert.
I am the daughter of freedom fighters and farmers, bootleggers and number runners, copper color skin like clay, cooler than Indian summers, blooded by oracles and seers, water porters and healers, once were warriors, now killers and drug dealers. Mississippi, Choctaw and Creek, but raised in Baltimore, so my vernacular from the streets, we move carefully. My pack of wolves, they care for me prayerfully. You'll only lose a limb fooling with them. I am the product of a gypsy and a kingpin. I exist somewhere between Egypt and Sing Sing, born to be a revolutionary since a wee thing. Rebellion in the memory of the memories I was drinking. I am the product of prayers and potions and heartbreak and devotion. I come from gorgeous women who cut and shoot and don't say sorry later. Short-tempered, easily provoked. They possess spirits, conjure worlds, see the future, clutch they pearls, stay hella woke. Enchantment, birth and raise babies, yup, lots of them. And living room floors with no doctors or Western medicine. They carry water, talk to God, wash their hair up in the clouds. Cause they cool like that, and we strong like that. We cry silently, caressing our disappointments, tucking the hurt deep down inside of our ovaries for safekeeping, of course, until the next girl was born. Our heart was broken before I ever cut the cord. I was raised under the floorboards, the ones America likes to forget about. The ones on which you built your little pretty white house. Yeah, the ones on the prairies, the ones I'm talking about. Children torn from mothers by colonizers' orders, long before America ever had borders. Native babies stolen at tender ages, shipped to the West Indies to slavery. This is America. Don't get you slipping, no. We be the people you call low lives, dangerous, hood rats, wild, Indians, colored, incorrigible, untamed, savages, gangsters, niggas, go-getters, super predators, go figure, do for self, kings, queens, gods, master teachers, alchemists, Africans, natives, and bondage, but my spirit free. I was born to bring more light into the world. That's why you see so much fight in your girl, because God's work is so gangster. And I got so much more to be thankful for. I am red clay, dirt roads, ashe, tobacco field, prayer ties, sweet grass, peyote. I survived the trail of tears and slavery. This here is what you call unmatched bravery. And if you want this blessing on your stages, it ain't all about the money, but baby, you're gonna have to pay me. Say we call it reparations. See, I learned to sing, not in school, but in ways you wouldn't understand. See, singing wasn't about songs, it was about sound and the laying on of hands. I watched my grandmother pour pain from the aching bodies of sobbing grown men with a sound that started in her pit, escaped her lips, and made them whole again. We black Indian. This red and brown blood, it runs so deep. This ceremony, this sacrifice is nothing you could ever teach. lest you crawl back into the deep black womb of the healing lodge to rebirth yourself brand new and learn that we are just spiritual beings having a human experience and nothing else is ever true. We are spiritual beings having a human experience and nothing else is ever true.
The voice of Mumu Fresh brings together so many things across these false binaries. She is Black and Indigenous. She is woman. She is Muslim and Christian influenced. She is sophisticated and from the streets. We call it sophistiratchet, right? She is intellectual and she's artistic. She's an activist. She is so many things in one Black woman's body that is so brilliant and powerful that to pay attention to her, for me, as a scholar of Black religion and culture, is of the utmost importance.
Great. Thank you so much for that. Man, okay, so I got to go back and like YouTube all of these voices, learn more, do more, but we got one more voice. Rick, who did you bring for us?
I brought a man who had just an enormous influence on my own thinking about religion and religion in America in particular. He, at the time, was a professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and he came over to do a guest class at University of Tennessee, where I was in the religious studies program as an undergraduate. He subsequently went to University of California, Santa Barbara, where he was distinguished professor. And he, for a period of time, served as the president of the American Academy of Religion. And I want to give just a little snippet of a lecture that he gave at it's a conference about the Shemp decision, which was one of the key decisions, Supreme Court decisions related to religion in the public schools.
America is, in point of fact, an Aboriginal Euro-African culture. It was that from the day the Europeans set foot here, and it remains that, and it will not go away. And until we come to terms with this, then I think we're working in the wrong places on the wrong kinds of problems. I say this because Americans often assume that when they study other cultures and other religions, they are taking a stance from a neutral position, or they have a stance from a country that's free. And I'm going to look at these other folks here. And there's no reflection or reflexivity in their understanding. I remember a quite distinguished person who's a historian of religion. Matter of fact, they out of Chicago, I must say. And I was in New York with them one day, and we were on the Staten Island ferry, and we passed by, and they said, "Island, you know." People, oh, isn't it nice to see where all of our people came into America? And I said, you mean you don't know that we didn't come in there? I mean, you know, these are little simple things. I mean, I didn't want her to be a historian, but just little simple things that black folks didn't come through, as immigrants. So these are some of the problems we have when we go about trying to make sense of other people without, at the same time, making sense of ourselves. And so my work in American religion was prompted by trying to find a standpoint. Where do I stand as I look at something else? And do I raise the same issue once I know where I stand, and that where I stand requires some critical evaluation of that stance. And I think Americans, by and large, are woefully lacking in that regard.
Charles Long was just brilliant. He's unfortunately passed on now, but there was a period of time where if you wanted to say anything about Black religion in America, you had to touch base with Charles. Unfortunately, he really didn't write very much, which I never quite understood. He has edited a few volumes, but he is a voice you need to hear, and you can find YouTubes of his lectures, and they are well worth the effort to find. That's Charles H. Long.
Wow. You've all given us a taste that I know I'm going to go. I know what I'm going to be listening to, the four voices I'm going to be listening to in the next days and week. And I'm sure right, folks will be so enticed. They'll be running out to learn more very soon. I also have to say, Terrell, I feel like way more whole than I did.
It's amazing how that happened.
An hour ago. Oh my goodness. I can't thank you enough. All four of you, right, really were the dream team and vision in terms of at least what I was thinking about this episode. And you all said yes. I didn't have to go find any alternative guests or voices. I'm so thrilled that you would share your voices and ideas and work with us as we think about the past informing the present. And we're so grateful, right, that we've made space between us for the past, the share and shape this critical conversation, and looking forward to the ways that it's received. Yeah, I can't thank you enough. Anything you want to?
Yeah, I thank you as well. I appreciate the way in which you have contributed to our wholeness today. You know, so tomorrow you will be Black history. You will be a part of a legacy as a result of that which we have chronicled through Are We Whole Yet podcast. And so we thank you for that. And we celebrate you. We thank you that because of this medium, we'll be able to share so many more ways in which we can lift your voices up. And each one just pass that along. So thank you so much for all of that. We really have been expanded this afternoon.
God bless you all. Take care.
I'm walking the freedom line, family to hold my hand. If I don't make it through the night, I keep walking till I see the light.